Chapter 1: The Mysterious Letter. Sarah lived in a small, quiet town where everyone knew each other. She was a young woman with long, curly brown hair and bright green eyes that sparkled with curiosity. Her days were filled with routine, working at the local bookstore, helping her mother with gardening, and spending evenings reading by the fireplace. One sunny afternoon, as Sarah walked back to her house from the bookstore, she noticed something unusual in her mailbox. Among the bills and catalogs was an envelope that stood out. It was old-fashioned, made of thick paper with a wax seal bearing an intricate symbol she didn't recognize. Curious, Sarah carefully broke the seal and opened the envelope. Inside, she found a single sheet of paper with just one sentence typed on it: "Your past is not what you think it is." There was no signature or return address. Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine as she read the words over and over again. What could this mean? Her past seemed so ordinary, growing up in this small town with loving parents who had always been supportive. But now, this mysterious letter had planted a seed of doubt in her mind. Chapter 2: The Strange Encounter. The next day, Sarah tried to shake off the feeling of unease left by the letter. She went about her day as usual, helping customers at the bookstore and chatting with friends in town. However, she couldn't help but feel like someone was watching her. As she walked through the town square during lunchtime, she noticed a man standing near the fountain. He was tall and wore a long coat that seemed out of place in the warm weather. His face was stern, but not unkind. His eyes seemed to hold a deep sadness. Their eyes met for just a moment before he nodded slightly and disappeared into the crowd. Sarah felt startled but also intrigued. Who was this man? And why did he seem so familiar? Later that evening, as she walked home from work, Sarah found another note on her doorstep. This one was simpler than before, just 2 sentences: "Meet me at the old oak tree at midnight. Come alone." Chapter 3: Midnight Meeting. Midnight approached slowly for Sarah as she lay awake in bed thinking about everything that had happened since receiving that first mysterious letter. At exactly midnight, she got out of bed and dressed quickly in dark clothes so she wouldn't be seen. The old oak tree stood on the outskirts of town near an abandoned field where children used to play when they were younger. As Sarah approached it under moonlight casting eerie shadows around her feet, she saw him again, the man from earlier. He introduced himself as John without offering any further explanation about who he was or why he wanted to meet her here secretly under cover of darkness. John told Sarah that he had information about her past which could change everything. She knew about herself forevermore, but before he could reveal anything further, footsteps echoed through silence, breaking tension between them both, making them realize they weren't alone anymore. Chapter 4: The Chase. Panicked by sudden realization someone else might be watching them too, John grabbed hold onto Sarah's hand, pulling her away from old oak tree towards dense woods nearby where darkness enveloped everything around, making it difficult to navigate through thick foliage underfoot. While trying to avoid detection simultaneously, they ran as fast as possible, hearing footsteps getting closer, until finally reached the old cabin deep within woods hidden away centuries ago, forgotten time itself. John pushed open creaky door, ushering inside, locking behind, ensuring safety momentarily, at least until further notice. Breathless, exhausted yet relieved, having escaped immediate danger outside momentarily, Sarah turned towards John, demanding answers long overdue now more than ever before. Chapter 5: The Revelation. Inside dimly lit cabin, lit only flickering candlelight casting shadows walls around them, John began to explain truth behind mysterious events unfolding the past few days, starting adoption, childhood, following tragic accident involving biological parents whose identities remained unknown until now. According to revelations made by John himself, biological parents belonged to a secret organization operating shadows, decades hiding plain sight, manipulating events shaping the world according to their agenda. Unknown masses, general public. Unaware existence, let alone extent, influence wielded globally, speaking terms, power, politics, money, etc. ad infinitum. But they're more. Sarah herself, unwitting pawn, larger game played out over years. Without knowledge, consent, whatsoever, leaving feeling betrayed, confused, scared, future uncertain once again. Due circumstances beyond control entirely. Chapter 6, Betrayal. As the door creaked open, Mrs. Jenkins stood in the doorway, her expression cold and sinister. The warmth and kindness that Sarah had always associated with her were gone, replaced by a calculating gaze. "John," Mrs. Jenkins said, her voice firm but laced with a hint of sadness. "I should have known you'd try something like this." John stepped forward, his eyes locked on Mrs. Jenkins. "You've been hiding the truth from her for too long, Margaret," he said, using her first name with a tone of familiarity that made Sarah's heart sink. Mrs. Jenkins turned to Sarah, her eyes softening slightly. "Sarah, I'm sorry you had to find out this way. But you need to understand." "No," John interrupted, his voice rising. "She deserves to know the truth. She deserves to know why she's been living a lie." Sarah felt like she was trapped in a nightmare. The people she trusted most were standing before her, revealing secrets and lies that shattered everything she thought she knew about her life. "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're not just any ordinary person, Sarah," Mrs. Jenkins began, her voice measured. "You're part of something much bigger than yourself. Your parents were part of our organization, and their work was crucial to our mission. But why did you keep it from me?" Sarah demanded, feeling anger and betrayal well up inside her. "We were protecting you," Mrs. Jenkins explained. "After your parents' accident, we took steps to ensure your safety. We couldn't let anyone know who you really are or what you might be capable of." John snorted. "Protecting her? You've been using her as a pawn in your game all along." The tension in the room escalated as Mrs. Jenkins and John faced off against each other. Their words turned into accusations and threats, each one trying to outmaneuver the other. Chapter 7, The Tragic End. The argument between Mrs. Jenkins and John grew more heated by the minute. The cabin was small, and the air was thick with tension as they stood facing each other. "You'll never get away with this," Mrs. Jenkins spat at John. "Oh, I think I will," John retorted, his eyes glinting with determination. Sarah watched in horror as the situation spiraled out of control. She tried to intervene, but both Mrs. Jenkins and John were too caught up in their own battle to listen. In a sudden burst of violence, Mrs. Jenkins lunged at John with a small knife she had pulled from her pocket. John dodged just in time but countered with a fierce blow that sent Mrs. Jenkins crashing into the fireplace. The impact was loud and jarring. Flames from the fireplace erupted as Mrs. Jenkins fell into them. John tried to pull her out but was too late. She was engulfed by flames. In a desperate attempt to save himself from being next, John grabbed Sarah and tried to use her as a shield against any further attack from Mrs. Jenkins' allies who might still be lurking outside or within cabin itself. But it was too late. Flames had already spread rapidly throughout cabin due to old wooden structure catching fire easily under such circumstances. As they struggled near entrance trying escape inferno behind them, both realized there no way out anymore except through flames themselves, which would mean certain death either way. In final act, desperation combined sheer will survive against all odds. Both managed to push each other away, simultaneously resulting both falling back into burning cabin where ultimately perished together amidst chaos, destruction surrounding them everywhere around. Aftermath. Days turned into weeks as Sarah recovered from the physical wounds she sustained during the tragic events. The hospital became her temporary home, a place where she could reflect on the past, present, and future. Her mind was filled with questions and emotions, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. As she lay in her hospital bed, Sarah couldn't help but think about the people she had lost. Mrs. Jenkins, who had been like a mother to her, and John, whose true intentions were still a mystery. The pain of their betrayal and the tragedy of their deaths weighed heavily on her heart. Eventually, the day came when Sarah was discharged from the hospital. She returned to her hometown but found it changed beyond recognition. Every familiar place now felt alien and foreign, haunted by memories of what had transpired. The old oak tree stood as a stark reminder of the night that changed everything. The bookstore where she used to work seemed empty and hollow without Mrs. Jenkins' warm smile or John's enigmatic presence. Leaving behind, Sarah realized she couldn't stay in a place that held so many painful memories. She decided to leave behind the only home she had ever known and start anew elsewhere. With a small suitcase in hand and a heart full of mixed emotions, Sarah boarded a train heading towards an unknown destination. As the train chugged out of the station, she watched her hometown fade into the distance, a bittersweet goodbye to a life she once knew. New beginnings. The journey was long and introspective. Sarah had plenty of time to reflect on her past and contemplate her future. She read books, talked to fellow passengers, and observed the changing landscapes outside her window. After several days of travel, Sarah arrived at a small coastal town she had never heard of before. The air was fresh, filled with the scent of salt water and blooming flowers. It was a place where no one knew her name or her past, a clean slate waiting to be written upon. Sarah settled into a small apartment overlooking the sea and began working at a local cafe. She made new friends who knew nothing about her previous life, a welcome change from the secrets and lies that had defined her past. Healing and growth. Time passed slowly but surely as Sarah healed both physically and emotionally. She found solace in simple things, watching sunsets over the ocean, reading books by the window, and listening to stories from strangers who became friends. Sarah started writing her own story, a journal where she documented her journey from darkness to light. It was therapeutic, allowing her to process everything she had gone through. As months turned into years, Sarah's heart began to heal. She learned to trust again, not people necessarily but herself. She discovered strength within herself that she never knew existed, a resilience born out of adversity. Finding peace. One day, while walking along the beach at sunset, Sarah felt an overwhelming sense of peace wash over her. It was as if all the pieces of her life had finally come together in a way that made sense. She realized that even though her past was marked by tragedy and betrayal, it had also given her something invaluable: the ability to appreciate life's beauty in its simplest forms. Sarah smiled softly as she watched waves gently lap against the shore. For the first time in years, she felt truly alive, free from secrets and lies but rich in experience and wisdom.